Hello, this is chapter 4 where we're going to have a tour of the cell. Let's start by talking about the picture shown on the screen. I took this picture when I was working on my dissertation research on a type of macroalgae that lives on coral reefs, and I took this picture with a transmission electron microscope. That type of microscope allows you to see structures that are inside the cell, in a single cell, and at a very high level of detail. So what we're seeing here is the inside of the algae, and notably the cell membrane here, where I'm going to drag the pen. Cell membrane here has actually pulled away from the cell wall of the algae, which remains intact. And so there's a void here. That's actually an artifact of the preservation process, preparing these samples for visualization with the microscope, or just preserving them for the time from the time they were collected until the time they're ready to be observed with the microscope. But what I really want to draw your attention to is what's going on inside that cell membrane. You can see some organelles, specifically chloroplasts, although they don't appear green because with the electron microscopes you don't see color, it's only in grayscale, but these are indeed chloroplasts, kind of all connected to the cell membrane. That's how they get around. And some of them you can notice like a white spot inside. Those are actually starch grains. Remember that when a plant produces more food than it needs, or algae, this is algae, not plant. When a plant or algae produces more food than it needs, it can store that excess food in the form of starch. And over time, some of these chloroplasts actually become starch, basically. A new organelle called an ameloplast, which would be the one shown here, is basically just 100% starch held within a membrane-bound organelle. So it's complex, yes. There are different kinds of cells. This is just one example of a cell. So in the first part of the lesson, we're going to start with like a broad overview of what is the cell and what are the basic types of cells. So let's get started with that. These are other types of cells. In fact, I took this picture in our lab at Broward College with the compound light microscope, and you'll get to look at these at some point in the semester if you're taking the lab on campus. These are red blood cells from a sheep. Of course, we get that from a biological supply company. Notice how beautiful they are, how perfectly round, and some pigment inside as they are red blood cells. So what are cells? We've looked at now two different examples of cells. By definition, cells are the basic unit of life. Remember that when we talked about the levels of organization, that the cell is the level that differentiates a living from a non-living thing. All living things must have a minimum of one cell. In fact, some organisms are one cell, but some are comprised of many cells. So if we talk about cells a little bit more, still general, but getting into the two main groups of cells, those would be the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells. Just from looking at these images, which were both taken with a transmission electron microscope, but you can't say that the sizes are comparable here because there's no scale bar. So although a eukaryotic cell is generally larger and more complex than the prokaryotic cell, you can't just assume that from pictures sometimes unless there's a scale bar that you can say, oh, well, that's, at the same scale, or try to rescale it so it is like you're comparing apples to apples with the scale. So when looking at these two cells, a few things should stand out. The fact that there's a lot more going on inside of that eukaryotic cell on the left. And that cell specifically is a type of dinoflagellate. It's a single-celled eukaryotic microalgae. Lives in water. It's actually the organism that's responsible for red tide that occurs in ocean waters, typically like the Gulf of Mexico. And on the right here, we have a bacterium. So I want to give you an opportunity to see what you might remember or what information you can gather from looking at this comparison, this visual of the eukaryotic cell versus the prokaryotic cell. So at this time, I would like you to pause your video and see if you can fill in this table comparing eukaryotes and prokaryotes for each of these 5 different criteria. After you've given it a try, go ahead, unpause, and we'll go through it together. And I'm going to go ahead with that now. So please pause if you haven't yet, if you'd like to try that exercise independently. All right, let's start with the first row here. Do they have a nucleus? Well, that is actually what differentiates a eukaryote from a prokaryote, whether or not they have a nucleus. Eukaryotes, yes, do have a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not. That is a rule we accept to be true. Now, the remaining ones are not all necessarily rules like the first, but they are generally true. So how big and complex are they? As mentioned previously, and as we can gain from the previous slide, eukaryotic cells are generally larger and more complex. In contrast, then we could say the opposite for prokaryotes, generally smaller and simpler. But what does it mean to be more complex for a eukaryotic cell? Well, that means that they have more of what are these organelles, tiny organs that really operate the cell, are responsible for the cell's function. Not that the prokaryotes don't have any organelles, but there's usually fewer and they're simpler in their nature of what they do for the cell. So a eukaryote would have membrane-bound organelles. And I'm going to list a few examples here that would only be found in a eukaryotic cell, but not in a prokaryotic cell. The nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle. So let's just list it here again, even though we've already mentioned it. And then we have things like mitochondria, only found in eukaryotic cell. Chloroplasts, found in some eukaryotic cells. We have all the organelles of the endomembrane system, including the smooth and rough ER, endoplasmic reticulum, that is. I have to scroll down here a bit. Let's see. Golgi apparatus. Okay, those are not all of them, but I want to just make sure we emphasize some. And in contrast, prokaryotes lack those membrane-bound organelles. But what they do have, in fact, all cells have ribosomes to make proteins. It's not actually an organelle, but cytoplasm would be the fluid that all of those organelles are like bathing in, filling in the spaces of the cell. It's not filled with air. It's filled with like a jelly-like fluid. That's the cytoplasm, but it's not really an organelle. And likewise, the cell membrane, all cells have that, but not truly an organelle to say. DNA would be in the cell of all cells, but again, it's not an organelle. So prokaryotes at a minimum have ribosomes. And so do eukaryotes, also have ribosomes. All cells must have ribosomes. So at a minimum, we're going to have ribosomes. Okay, so let's move on. We'll get into more detail with the organelles when we study those in specific in the next lesson. Are eukaryotes unicellular, multicellular, or both? Well, that's a tricky one. There are both types. And we'll get to the examples in the last box there. Prokaryotes, on the other hand, are only unicellular, single-celled. So what are some of these examples of organisms that contain eukaryotic cells? Or what are eukaryotes? Which phyla of organisms are eukaryotes? So let's start with, I'm going to break it down into the unicellular ones, although maybe I'll do it by phyla. So animals. So all animals are eukaryotes, and they're going to be multicellular. Plants, multicellular. Now, fungi is the group that can include single and multicellular. In fact, yeast is a single-celled fungi. In addition, protists can be both unicellular and multicellular. All right, but prokaryotes, keep it simple. We're talking about the single-celled organisms that are lacking a nucleus here. So these would be one of two groups of prokaryotes, either the bacteria, which are more of like your common everyday prokaryotes, and then the ones that live in those really extreme environments, like at the bottom of the ocean at the hydrothermal vents, or hot springs, geysers, salty or low oxygen locations. So those are the more extremophile types, and those are in a group called the archaebacteria. Okay, so from this lesson, be sure you understand in general what is a cell and be able to put cells into these different categories and differentiate between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell. In the next lesson, we'll get into those organelles that are more found specifically in eukaryotes, but also some that are found in all cells.